Hey, storyteller. You have undoubtedly heard that you cannot have a story without conflict. Conflict is the lifeblood, the force that propels your story forward and keeps readers engaged. And that writing rule is true. You can't really have a story without conflict, but what's much less discussed is why that is. And also, what exactly is conflict? Why is it that a car chase scene and a quiet conversation scene can both be dripping with it? Or even better, why is it that sometimes the car chase scene can really fall flat while the quiet conversation could have the reader at the edge of their seat? That's what I'm going to discuss in this video to help you write conflict more effectively in your story. I'll cover the definition of conflict and how and when story conflict is different from real-life conflict, the purpose of story conflict in general, and then more specifically, the purpose of conflict on a global story-wide level and how that differs from the purpose of conflict on a scene level. And while writing better conflict will certainly help you improve your story, it's only one element of narrative structure. That's why this video is part of a series of 5 where I cover 4 foundational elements of story structure: conflict, circumstance, character, and consequence. And then I crown it all with an overarching deep dive into how they interact and build on each other to give your story an unshakable page-turning structure. The video about the purpose of circumstance or setting is already out, and the next one will be about consequences or stakes. So if this sounds useful to you, subscribe so that you get notified about the next video. For now, on the topic of story conflict, let's dig in. What is conflict in story? Depending on your background, you might have been taught conflict as the clashing of opposing forces, as internal versus external, or as an obstacle in the way of a character's goal. Or if it was something else entirely, let me know in the comments. I'm genuinely curious. But for our purposes of fiction writing, the most useful way to think of story conflict is as an obstacle in the way of a character's goal. This could be an opposing force, like another character who has a different goal that is incompatible with your first character's goal. In other words, they can't both get what they want. So they are obstacle in each other's way, so you get conflict. For example, Richard wants to buy the last pair of ultra-popular sneakers for his son, but Sally wants them for her son. I call this the can't both win conflict. But conflict could also be an inanimate obstacle in the way of your character's goal, like weather, disease, or infrastructure. Perhaps Joe wants to cross the river and finds that the bridge has collapsed. He's got a goal, there's an obstacle, and that's conflict. I call this circumstantial conflict. And a third rough bucket for conflict is when a character has a goal but doesn't want to achieve that goal via a specific method. Katniss wants to win the Hunger Games. All she has to do is kill Peeta, but she doesn't want to kill Peeta. Or Linda wants a bicycle, but she doesn't want to just steal the bicycle that someone has left unlocked. In this case, the characters have goals, and their obstacle is their own beliefs about how they should conduct themselves in the world. I call this the don't want it that way conflict. You might be pegging this as internal conflict, and you're technically right, but the framework of internal and external conflict deserves its own video that I will make in the future. If you're watching from the future, it might pop up here. You might also notice that 2 or 3 of these categories can, and sometimes do, happen at the same time. Climactic and high-tension scenes often have all 3 obstacle types coinciding. This principle of goal and obstacle for story conflict is pretty straightforward, but where I so often see writers go wrong is that they confuse principles of real-life conflict with story conflict. You see, in real life, we definitely do perceive obstacles in the way to our goals as conflict. But we also perceive so much else as conflict. Basically anything that scares us or makes us feel bad, we read as conflict. For example, imagine that you're going to the store to get groceries. You walk in and someone walking out scoffs and says how awfully ugly your shoes are. Now, this person doesn't keep you from your goal of getting groceries at all. But unless you have exceptionally thick skin or are immersed in a life full of mean-spirited people, you will likely be a bit upset about that remark. It will feel like you just encountered conflict. In real life, that's valid and understandable, but in fiction, this scenario would fall flat on its own. I often read manuscripts filled with shouting matches and snide remarks, and the writers think that their scenes are chock full of conflict, and then they're wondering why it doesn't feel that way. The thing is that if the shouting match or snide remark or even the car chase in your story doesn't directly present an obstacle in the way of your character's goal, it's not story conflict. You can certainly still have those shouting matches and car chases, but don't expect them to structurally move the story forward. Why is that, you're asking? Great question, which brings me to our next point. What is the purpose of conflict in stories? To dig into this a bit more, let's take a step back as to why we as humans bother to tell stories at all. I have a whole video on this topic, but in short, it's pretty odd and interesting that we as a species developed storytelling. While other species have communication systems, none of them have make-believe narratives that they share. One of the many reasons why we evolved to tell stories is that it enables social learning, which is crucial and never-ending in a species as intensely socially complex as ours. By consuming stories, we simulate what decisions are worth making in life. And so, what we're highly attuned to in stories is character decision-making, more specifically, the decisions characters make in really tough situations. The easy decisions, those we have already figured out. It's the tough decisions that we want to simulate and learn from. Well, characters cannot make tough decisions without conflict. A story in which a character has a goal and achieves it without conflict is boring to us because it doesn't teach us anything about what decisions are worth making in life. A story where a character has a goal and encounters an obstacle, well, we'll tune into that because we innately want to learn from that character's mistakes and successes from the safety of our own heads. So this is why conflict feels exciting to us and feels like it's moving the story forward. And it's also why if the character doesn't make a decision and the conflict is resolved externally, such as in a Deus Ex Machina, we feel cheated and dissatisfied with the story. So that's the purpose of conflict in general. But there is an important structural difference in how to approach writing conflict globally, so on a story-wide level, and how it works at a scene level. Additionally, it's important that if you're finding value in this video, that you hit the like button. I'd really appreciate it. Let's look at the purpose of conflict on a story-wide level. So, how do you communicate to an audience what decisions are worth making in life through your story? Well, first you figure out what you're trying to say with your story. That is, your theme. And I have said a lot about theme and how to write it in previous videos. But in short, you illustrate theme through key choices that your characters make. Then you ensure that your conflict pushes your characters to make the key thematic decisions at climactic points in the story. Now, I know this sounds quite abstract, so let me break it down with an example and look at All Systems Red by Martha Wells. This is the first novella in the Murderbot Diaries series and an absolute gem of a book. It won the Nebula and the Hugo Awards. I know it's been adapted into a TV series, but I haven't watched that, so I'm exclusively referencing the book here. If you're not familiar with it, All Systems Red is set in a far future world and is the story of a part bot, part human construct that calls itself Murderbot. Murderbot is a security unit that's rented out by various expeditions, but it managed to hack its own governor module, and so it no longer has to obey commands. It is a free agent. The book opens with it still pretending to be a functioning security unit and obeying commands while it's secretly watching thousands of hours of soap operas. This book is a great action romp and immensely entertaining, but I believe the reason it resonated so deeply with critical and popular audiences is because it uses its conflict so well to develop its theme. Thematically, what the story is saying is that it's better to choose autonomy over conformity. It could also be framed as choosing humanity over authority and following orders. It's always hard to retroactively engineer these statements for already existing works, but I feel this is close enough. So if that is its key thematic choice, autonomy versus following orders, then the conflict has to be engineered such that at the story climaxes, this choice is put to the test. I will say that because this novella is structurally more similar to a short story than to a novel, it has this thematic choice only at two crucial points, which is the midpoint climax and the end resolution. The scope of this story just didn't need it more than twice. But in a longer novel, a thematic choice often comes up 3 or more times simply because of the complexity of the scope. So don't get hung up on how many times the conflict should test the thematic choice. The key takeaway here is that the purpose of the story's global conflict is to force your protagonist into a difficult choice that reveals what you want to tell your readers about what choice is better. Wells creates this conflict as such. Murderbot is being rented by a group of researchers that are called Preservation Ox. It likes these people, but its overarching goal is to not let them figure out that it doesn't have a functioning governor module, because security units, without those, they get destroyed and salvaged for parts. It very much would not like to be salvaged for parts. Its other overarching goal is to not let any of the Preservation Ox people die. It would be a very bad security unit if it failed to provide security. Clear goals and clear stakes. The conflict then escalates little by little so that Murderbot finds itself in a situation with fundamental obstacles to both of those goals. I'm now going to spoil the two key thematic choice moments of this book, so if you don't want spoilers, just skip ahead to the next timestamp. And by the way, the reason that conflicts around thematic choice points feel like such spoilers is because they sort of are the story. They are its core, so how does Wells use conflict to reveal this core? Basically, Murderbot goes on an expedition with some of its people to investigate why another research crew, that are called Deltfall, on the other side of the planet, suddenly went silent. When it arrives, it finds that the humans of Deltfall had all been killed by their security units. Murderbot fights the evil security units and is overpowered. The evil units then put a combat module into Murderbot's data port. This module begins downloading, and it will override Murderbot's choices and force it to kill the Preservation Ox people, including their leader, Dr. Mensa, whom Murderbot genuinely likes. This development is a huge obstacle to its goals. It wants to remain a free agent, but this module is enslaving it essentially. It wants the Preservation Ox crew to live, but this module wants to kill them. And remember, Murderbot itself wants to live. If it lets the combat module take over, it would get to live. It would kill the crew, but Murderbot would survive and then just be returned back to the company to be rented out by another crew. I hope it's clear how this conflict is specifically targeting the theme of the story. Murderbot absolutely has to make a choice between autonomy and following orders, and it's a choice with huge trade-offs, and its decision demonstrates what it values most. Well, if you've read the book, you know that it chooses to tell its people that they have to kill it before it kills them. When the people don't, it turns its gun on itself and fires. It values its autonomy and humanity more than its own life and refused to become a killing machine. Well, refused to become one again. We learn through its backstory that this had happened to it once before, where it was overridden and killed its whole crew. It chooses to not let that happen again. It's through this conflict and choice cycle that stories are able to construct meaningful theme while still feeling exciting and like they're not preaching. But if you remember, I said this choice to save its people from itself happened around the midpoint. So again, spoiler, but Murderbot survives. It managed to incapacitate itself enough for the Preservation Ox scientists to delete the combat module code and to repair Murderbot's body. But now the crew knows that Murderbot does not have a functioning governor module, so we see that its choice cost it a huge price. So for the rest of the book, they work together to figure out who is trying to kill them and why, and also how to get off planet safely. Spoiler again. They all get off the planet, but Murderbot is badly hurt. While Murderbot is being repaired, Dr. Mensa ensures that Murderbot's memory is not wiped, and she buys its contract, so that she can take it to her world, where human-bot hybrids are recognized as people and not as machines. In a lesser writer's hands, this would be the sweet, happy ending of All Systems Red, and it would be a fine book. But remember, conflict is an obstacle to the character's goal. Murderbot wants autonomy. That is its goal and its thematic choice. If Dr. Mensa is its guardian, even if she's a great guardian, which she absolutely is, Murderbot is not free. And so, this ending presents the final conflict of the book, and with it, Murderbot's final choice for the book, which ends with some of the best and most moving lines of any story that I've read. That's why I left you, Dr. Mensa, my favorite human. By the time you get this, I'll be leaving Corporation Rim. Out of inventory and out of sight. Murderbot, end message. One of the key strengths of this ending is that the book saw its story-wide conflict to its logical conclusion. It stayed true to its theme and demonstrated to the reader just how far Murderbot is willing to go to gain autonomy and make its own decisions for itself. So the purpose of story-wide conflict is to illustrate your story's theme by pushing your protagonist into making difficult thematic choices. But if those choice points occur only a few times throughout the book, depending on its scope, then what is the purpose of the conflict on a scene level for all of the other scenes of the book? Well, for the big turning points in stories to carry a lot of weight, the reader requires a lot of information. If I told you that Katniss offered her friend Peeta some berries, that statement would be positively banal. But when you know the full circumstances, that they're the two final tributes standing in a deadly game where there can be only one victor, and that the berries are poisonous, you suddenly feel differently about the situation. Add to that the knowledge that the victor would get fame and glory and lots of food and resources in a highly impoverished district, your feelings heighten yet again. You get my drift. Basically, a ton of your story structure is set up for the big payoffs that illustrate what you're trying to say with your story. And story conflict contributes to this setup in two ways. The most obvious way is that it allows you to create an engaging cause and effect structure and a sense of progression. When your character has a goal and there is an obstacle in their way, they have to decide how to deal with that. That decision should then have an effect that leads to the next plot goal and/or conflict. Let's look at All Systems Red again as an example. The story opens with Murderbot trying to listen to music because it is bored. It is idly overseeing the Preservation Aux crew doing research on the planet that they're exploring. Murderbot's goal is to soon get back to the camp so that it can watch its soap operas. But then a giant worm erupts from the earth and tries to eat Dr. Bardwaj. Murderbot jumps into the creature's mouth, fires its arm guns and blast cannon into the creature, and manages to get Dr. Bardwaj and Dr. Valescu back to base camp alive. So that's a decision there in response to a conflict. The effect of that decision is that now the Preservation Aux crew, who previously thought of Murderbot as just a bot, realize it is highly advanced and effective and that it has a human face. So they begin treating it as a person. Dr. Mensa, the leader of the crew, begins consulting it as more abnormalities crop up in the course of their expedition. The consultations lead to new decisions, new conflicts, and the plot advances through cause and effect. Your scenes should ideally be structured in this way, even though the decisions that the characters are making are not necessarily thematic decisions, at least not in every scene. But they are decisions that feed into the second way that conflict functions on a scene level. And that is as a non-intrusive info dump. It reveals to the reader the other three roots of narrative structure: character, circumstance, and consequence. And it does it without making you feel like it's exposition. So conflict in a scene can be an effective catalyst to communicate to the reader who the characters are in terms of their beliefs, goals, flaws, and quirks, what circumstances that they're finding themselves in, and what consequences they're trying to avoid or are causing. This information is crucial because the reader has to understand all these elements to fully get the weight and meaning of the character decisions, especially the big thematic ones. And yes, a scene often can have two or all three of these reveals happening simultaneously. The conflict is what makes it interesting to us because of how our brains are attuned to social information and decision-making information. Let's again look at All Systems Red and its first scene to see what I'm talking about here. When the giant worm tries to eat Dr. Bardwaj, we get to see what's important to Murderbot based on how it rescues her very matter-of-factly. But then, when it tries to get Dr. Valescu to come to safety, Dr. Valescu is immobilized and in a state of shock. Murderbot has only 2 arms, and it's using them to hold Dr. Bardwaj and keep her from bleeding out. So its decision is to respond to this conflict by showing its human face to Dr. Valescu and calmly and gently coax him out of shock and into coming with Murderbot to safety. This calculated social intelligence, combined with the typical action hero traits, are excellently contrasting character reveal moments. But that character reveal is not even all there is in the first scene. We also learn more about the circumstances of this situation and setting, and how the whole team of researchers operates and what's important to them by the fact that they instantly mobilize for rescue and they care more about people than equipment. We learn that's not always typical in this setting. And we learn that in this world, security units are regarded as equipment. As for consequences, well, Murderbot can do whatever it wants because it hacked its governor module, but it doesn't want the humans to notice that. And so, in that opening scene, we get to see how it has to ask for certain permissions, and we understand what would happen to it if its module hack were discovered. In other words, we get the stakes. So the opening scene works on many levels and has immense information density while still being entertaining and accessible. And that engagement is due to the conflict directing and organizing the reader's attention. Remember, we are attuned to character decisions and all the stuff that we need to know for those decisions to make sense. And conflict is what forces those decisions. Now, you might be asking, does every scene have to use conflict to create this cause and effect chain and to reveal the other narrative roots? The answer is technically no, in that you don't need these moves in every single scene, but you probably want to make sure that your conflict functions in these ways in most of your scenes. I have a tool that I call the momentum measure that can give you more concrete guidelines for reader engagement scene to scene. You can check it out here. And if you want to dig more into the structure and function of theme in fiction, this playlist is for you. My name is Tina. I'm a writer, writing coach, and recovering academic. Until next time, write on.